Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. This video is the first of a series about climate as a religion. Many religions promote the idea that if you misbehave, lack faith, or ask questions, you will suffer a great hellfire. This is exactly what we see about climate. Every day we hear predictions of tremendous heat in the future and fires. These predictions are made by modern-day prophets who are now academics or people working at research institutions. And we're not permitted to question these predictions. Anyone who dares question them is ostracized and warned of tremendous danger. And most importantly, the key aspect to preventing this danger is sacrifice. Our leaders have always taught us that sacrifice is the key to controlling the climate. Let's look at some of the prophecies of hellfire currently in the newspapers. Can you stand the heat? It keeps getting hotter. Yes, summers in the U.S. really are getting warmer. Record highs. The new normal, Earth is getting hotter. And as the planet gets hotter, some mammals may get smaller. I guess that would explain why mammals in Africa, like elephants and giraffes, are so small. We constantly hear claims that summers are getting hotter and heat waves are getting worse in the U.S. Let's look and see if those claims are accurate. We'll start by looking at this date, May 21st in 1934. It's very cool this year on May 21st, but in 1934 the United States was incredibly hot. There were 100-degree weather in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and even West Virginia was 100 degrees at Martinsburg, West Virginia on May 21st, 1934. Today's forecast for Martinsburg was closer to 60 degrees, about 40 degrees cooler than it was in 1934. And on May 21st, 1934, almost every single state had 90-degree temperatures indicated by these yellow dots. The red dots indicate 100-degree temperatures. Now let's compare May 21st, 1934 with May 21st of last year, which experts said was the hottest year on record. This is the equivalent map for May 21st, 2016. Notice that there was almost no 90-degree weather in the country that day, even in the southern areas of Texas and Arizona. So perhaps May 21st of 2016 was a fluke. What we really need to do to analyze climate is to look at the trends. This is the percent of stations over 90 degrees on May 21st every year going back to 1895. What this graph shows us is that May 21st used to be a lot hotter in the United States. The hottest May 21st was 1934. The second hottest was 1925. The third hottest was 1941. Back in the 30s, about 15% of stations were over 90 degrees in the United States on May 21st. That's gone down to about 5% in recent years. There were big spikes in May 21st heat in the US in the 1920s, in the 1930s, and the 1960s. But generally, the trend over the last 80 years is that May 21st has been getting much cooler in the US, with last year being one of the coolest on record. Now let's look at one specific station on May 21st. If you remember, Martinsburg, West Virginia was 100 degrees on May 21st, 1934. The second hottest year was a year earlier, May 21st, 1933. But generally, May 21st temperatures in Martinsburg has plummeted about 10 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1930s, with the last few years being among the coolest on record. Here are some newspaper articles from May 21st, 1934, discussing the tremendous heat and drought the United States was experiencing. One of the most telling news stories about the heat in May 1934 is that there was a tremendous increase in beer consumption during that month at the expense of hard liquor, and this was right after the end of the Prohibition. Most of the U.S. was very hot on May 21st, 1934, but this year it's quite cool in the U.S. In fact, I rode my bike yesterday up to the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where Kevin Trenberth works, who's one of the leading climate alarmists. There was a ton of snow up there. So I'm sure there's some people out there who are thinking that I'm cherry picking by picking May 21st. Perhaps May 21st is just a fluke. So let's look at the temperatures for the entire month of May. This graph shows the average percentage of May days over 90°F at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations. We can see from this graph that the three hottest Mays in the United States were 1934, 1911, and 1962, and that generally the frequency of 90-degree days in the entire month of May has plummeted in the U.S., and that in fact the three most recent years have been among the coldest Mays on record. You might be wondering now, why was 1934 so hot? Well, one of the reasons was that there was an incredible drought across the United States. About 80% of the U.S. was in drought that summer. Much of it was in extreme drought, shown in brown. When the soil is dry, temperatures tend to rise to very extreme levels. So I've shown that I wasn't cherry picking May 21st, but there's probably some people out there who think I'm cherry picking May. Perhaps the trend is different for the rest of the summer. So let's look at the graph of 90-degree days at all United States Historical Climatology Network stations for the entire year. We can see that the frequency of 90-degree days in the U.S. has plummeted over the last 80 years. And in fact, 1934 wasn't the hottest summer, 1936 was. There were big spikes in 90-degree weather in the 1930s and the 1950s, but since about 1960, 90-degree weather has become much less common, and recent years have been unusually cool, near a record low. It's clear at this point that the claims of increasing heat and hellfire moving forward into the future are absurd. It's the exact opposite of the trend. But there's another aspect to the hellfire claim. It's actual fire itself. So let's look at that data. What we see once again in this data from the United States Forest Service is that the total acreage burned in the United States has plummeted since the 1930s. It's down about 80%. And this isn't very surprising because it was much hotter and drier in the 1930s than it is now. If we go back even further to pre-industrial levels of CO2, we see an even larger drop. Historically, fire has been a frequent and major ecological factor in North America. In the conterminous United States during the pre-industrial period, when carbon dioxide was below 300 parts per million, an average of 145 million acres burned annually. Today, only 14 million acres, federal and non-federal, are burned annually by a wildland fire from all ignition. So fires are down 90% since CO2 was at pre-industrial levels. So what I've shown you in this video is that the claims of heat and hellfire, which are coming from the climate prophets, are the exact opposite of what's happening. And that's exactly why we're not allowed to question them. If we ask any questions, then it becomes obvious that these people are lying. It's a religion, not a science. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.